Can you hear? Oh, okay. So I hope everybody understands English here. So I'm Andrea Barisani from InversePad, and I'll be talking to you about evil maid and physical access attacks, which if you're not familiar with the term evil maid, I can understand that sounds very funny, but it's all going to make sense in a few seconds, hopefully. So just a little bit of introduction about who I am. I'm a security researcher and developer. I'm the founder of a company called InversePath, also of an effort called the Open Source Computer Security Incidents Response Team, which is called OSCERT because we cannot use the name Computer Emergency Response Team for a long series of legal reasons. And I'm a speaker and training about many, many conferences. And I deal specifically with security of information systems which are tied to also safety-related areas, such as automotive or avionics or industrial automation devices. These are the specialty of the things that we do. And for this reason, we work and we've been working a lot with hardware, and this is going to be relevant for the topic that we're going to address. So we were one of the first ones to talk about hacking into cars almost 10 years ago, which now it's a thing, of course, so it was a little bit ahead of the time. In 2009, before the Snowden era, we were joking about exotic ways to sniff your keystrokes from the power line, and with Tempest attacks, joking in our slides that maybe the NSA can do it. And then, of course, the Snowden leaks came out, so that was also ahead of the time. We did a lot of talks about financial payments, infrastructure, and so on. And this talk, which is about physical security attacks and a specific kind of attacks against unattended machines, it's also something that many, many years ago was believed to be something unrealistic and very novel and not worthy of too much attention. But we're also seeing that in very, very recent years, because of all of the issues that we know, which I think are particular focus also of this event, they're starting to becoming more increasingly being exploited in the wild. And I'll be also mention a little bit, last year we did a project called the USB Armory, and this will also play a role in some of the things that I'm gonna explain. But this is just to give you a little bit of an introduction about who I am. So what are evil maid attacks? Okay, what does it mean? It's kind of an interesting word. So it doesn't mean this, okay? This is not an evil maid attack, okay? Just let's keep that in mind. So, by the way, this picture was sent to me by a Bloomberg journalist when we were discussing about evil maid attacks. So I thought it was really funny that a journalist would send this to me. But I think it was spot on, so I decided to use it in our slide. And you know, it's Japan, so these things are bound to be there on the interwebs. Anyway, so evil maid. So evil maid is a term which was introduced by my friend Joanna Rutkowska, which is the leader of a very interesting project which is called CubesOS, which you should really take a look at. So in 2009, she coined this term to explain a very specific class of attacks, which concern attacks against unattended devices where you have physical access on them. So we're not talking about exploit through the browser, through the internet, something that, you know, phishing or you open your email or a virus. We're talking about attacks where I gain physical access to your device and I do something with it. And the goal, and the reason why it's called evil maid, because the typical scenario is that you leave your laptop in the hotel room and the maid, which is going to clean up your room, she's evil or he's evil, and then they're going to compromise your laptop. Either immediately or leaving something on your device, which could be anything, the laptop is the standard scenario, that in the future will aid a compromise. So this is the issue, the security of unattended device. And these kind of attacks leverages on physical security and hardware security, which is why I made a connection with the hardware security, because we're not talking about something which is purely software, because we're dealing with the physics, with the physical entities of the hardware that we're gonna attack. So in some ways, everybody knows about evil maid attacks, because if you think about ATM skimmers, you know, tampering with an ATM with a specific device that at some point is going to steal your credit card information or steal the PIN is some sort of evil maid attack. It is an attack which is performed against for a certain period of time, unattended device, by leveraging on the physical properties of the device. So here, very interesting, we see a fake PIN pad which was overlaid. This is completely fake. Here was some interception tools over the top of the ATM. So there was a mobile phone acting as a video camera to see the PIN. This is a schema that we developed for research, which was leveraging on the specific physical form factor of a point-of-sale device to be completely hidden to the user and to the owner of the device. So also these, in some ways, are some sort of evil Maid attack. And this is so this was the research, and this was the practice done by criminals a few years before. And this is actually very professionally made. Can you tell me what this is? Does anybody know what this long trace is? That's an antenna. So it's used for relaying, for exfiltrating the data. So not for reading the data, but for leaking the data out, which is also something that it is a topic where you're talking about evil Maid attacks to also somehow get the data out. Because if you don't get the data that you want immediately, you have to, at some point, to exfiltrate it, which could mean by coming the day after to clean the room again and get your data, or by other means. So the original example identified a very specific scenario where you leave your encrypted laptop in your room, unattended, so hotel room, typical example, and the attacker gains physical access to your laptop. And in 2009, disk encryption software wasn't accounting for this possibility. So if you would gain physical access to a laptop, it would be trivial to put some malware on the device that would allow you to extract the passphrase, which then unencrypts the data later on. And this is exactly, it's kind of the same problem that the FBI had with the iPhone, if you think about it. I mean, the scenario is a little different, but it all relates to the physical security and hardware security of these kind of devices. So in this case, what Joanna did in the first evil Maid scenario, they installed some software which would intercept the password for the TrueCrypt full disk encryption that was being used. So, and the problem is that the majority of security features that we have and that we discuss about are always for remote attack vectors. We talk about protection on browsers, protection on email clients, protection on servers, and so on. But the physical world and the hardware security is something which is often overlooked on personal devices. And this is where all of these attacks become an issue. And also, there's always an implicit trust between any device that you might have and its ports, its input-output. If I give you a USB drive because I want to give you a file, you're going to plug it on your laptop. And if that device, let's say, decided to act as a USB keyboard instead of a USB flash drive, there's no reason why I shouldn't do that. Only the form factor will tell you that it looks like a flash drive, but instead it's going to be a keyboard. That device can immediately inject keystrokes on your device and launch in a very split second. You're maybe not even going to be able to see it, a command, which then connect remotely, install a malware, and be done with it. And then maybe expose a normal flash drive. Because as soon as you plug something into your device, there's an implicit trust which is there. I mean, we want computer to work with people. We don't want you to make, to have to click on 1,000 dialogues to, ensure that the device that you're plugging is really the one that it's intended to be. This is not how it works. And often physical attacks against laptops or any kind of devices, they work by leveraging this kind of problem. So traditionally, if we look at the typical boot process of a PC, we have several elements that are going on. First, we have something which I assume you're all familiar with, which is the BIOS, which is the piece of code which gets executed immediately when your computer starts up. And the BIOS is responsible for taking decisions such as, shall I boot from USB, shall I boot from a CD-ROM, shall I boot from the hard drive, and setting up the very basic settings that then allow your more complicated operating system to be executed. Then you have a bootloader, which on some of you that have multiple operating systems on your computer is the one that, let's say, allow you to decide to boot between Windows or Linux, for instance. The bootloader then loads the kernel, which is the core of your operating system. It is a very privileged piece of code which stays in memory and handles pretty much everything from that point on. And then finally, we have user applications. And usually, the security of any computer, traditionally, relies on maintaining the boundary between the kernel and the user application. So in other words, to make sure, let's say, that if you have a browser exploit, if you're browsing a website with Chrome, that if you hit a very malicious, very sketchy and dodgy website, that whatever actions that website can do, they cannot affect either the browser itself or other applications that are running on the same OS or the OS itself. So the security between different applications, between different users of your OS, and especially from the kernel to the applications, that security typically is very strong. We want to protect the kernel from unwanted and malicious applications. However, the security of all of the process that happens before traditionally has been very, very pure, specifically if you can have access, physical access on the system that you're targeting. And this is because, of course, we want to allow freedom to people to launch whatever operating system they want, to recover the computer. Suppose that your Windows gets corrupted and you need to boot with in rescue mode. Of course, that's a very privileged operation, which allows you then to change the contents of your drive, to install a new OS. It's something that manufacturer, and rightly so, they want people to be able to do that. But this becomes the problem in the scenario, in the specific scenario that we are discussing. And so if you have an unprotected computer in front of you, even if you have only a few minutes to work with it, you can change the boot order. Let's say I boot from USB. I can modify the BIOS if I want to. I can modify the bootloader, and I can even modify the OS if specific countermeasures are not taken. So now most operating systems, we know that most applications are signed unless the user specifically opts out for signature verification, which is often the case because you want to install whatever software from the internet. But especially in the first phase, the security is much, much worse. And this is the problem. If you can inject malicious code at these stages, you can have complete access on the machine without any protection. You can hide yourself from even a kernel or a user application which is running. So the more closer you are to the hardware, which is going to this direction, the BIOS is the code which is probably as close as possible to the hardware, the more freedom you have to do whatever you want with your target, because you're much close to the bare metal, so to speak. That's what we used to say when you attack at this level. And so there are plenty of opportunities to do attacks at these stages when you have physical access to the hardware. So fairly recently, we are now starting to address these issues by implementing mechanisms such as, you can have password protection on the BIOS, that's the most basic thing, but also you can have a signed BIOS. So there are some computers where the BIOS can only come from specific manufacturers because they're cryptographically signed and they're verified by the hardware. So that's one way to prevent modification of the BIOS. You have secure boot, which is something that now, since Windows 10, every laptop with Windows 10 should support, where your hardware verifies that the bootloader that you're loading is signed with a specific key. In most cases, the key from Microsoft, for instance. So the hardware, the BIOS, holds a key, and this key is used to verify that the bootloader, that the integrity of the bootloader is maintained. So security is like a chain, and it is as strong as its weakest link. So in order to arrive from here to here with a full chain of trust, every step of the way needs to implement this kind of security procedures. So the bootloader must then hold some keys so that the kernel can also be verified as well. And this is called a verified boot. And while secure boot now, it is very common on most machines, verified boot is extremely rare. And specifically, if any of you is running Linux, your bootloader is not going to verify that the kernel that is being executed is signed in the overwhelming majority of cases. So the chain of trust gets broken here. And also, the kernel must be responsible that users' applications are signed. And also, this is something that doesn't happen all the time. So we do have different kind of countermeasures to prevent that at these various stages I can inject my code. But first of all, the problem that they're all separated, they're all separate entities, it is a problem on itself. There's not a coherent way of protecting the boot process, which goes from turning on your machine to having you logging in and using your browser. So the elements are all there, but most of the times we can find weaknesses in either all of them or even one of these stages. And if we have weaknesses in one of these stages, then we can most likely achieve our goal, which is being there somehow when your user applications are being executed. How do you protect your user applications? You can do encryption. That's one of the standard and accepted way. If you encrypt all of your computer data, and I boot a machine, I will arrive here. I will arrive to the kernel because the kernel has to boot because he has to ask you for the password. You know, otherwise nobody's going to ask for that. But at least your user applications will be safe. That's the easy way now to achieve protection at this point. But if I can put something before that, then I can intercept that password. And then at some point I'll be able to exfiltrate that password. And so if I take a copy of your disk, which is very easy to do, because I just open your machine, I take the disk out and I make a copy, then I will have the key and I can decrypt your data at some point. So you can understand how the complexity of modern system, which is, by the way, 20 times more complex than this very crude simplification, goes, of course, to disadvantage for the security of the system. So, and there's another issue, of course, that relates to what I mentioned before. We want people to be able to recover their machines if there's a problem. We want to be able to have you running your favorite operating system, whether it's Windows, OS X, Linux, or Plan 9, or FreeBSD, or OpenBSD. So secure boot on modern machines, it's something that you can always disable from the BIOS. So if the password protection it is not strong enough. So if we are at this point and this first layer of defense is not strong enough, I can always completely subvert the activation of secure boot. And usually password protection is something which is implemented in a very, very weak manner on all BIOSes. If I have access to a machine, maybe I need to open the chassis, maybe I need to plug some specific hardware which attach on a specific chip to do some specific operation, but it's not rocket science. It's something that a motivated attacker, so if you're an appealing target to anybody, then it's something that can be done very easily. So secure boots, you know, it is a very imperfect solution. It does raise the bar for the time which is required to compromise a system. And in this kind of scenario, time is important, right? Because I don't want to spend 8 hours in your hotel room tampering with your laptop because I want to be as quick as possible. But it's still something which is not a perfect solution. On embedded systems, on the other end, such as point-of-sale devices or in many other areas, automotive and so on, secure boot is something which is permanently set. And once you set a key for secure boot, it is fused there in the hardware, and it can never be changed. And this is something which is essential also for things like your phone, for not being able to jailbreak your phone. In that specific case, the manufacturer wants to protect its own hardware from you, the user, to compromise its security. So the scenario is completely different on those devices. You cannot easily unlock these devices, as you know, with iPhone jailbreaking. It would require a complex series of bugs. But on PCs such as this one, such as my laptop, this is something which can be completely subverted by design if you don't have specific protections. And also, the other thing is, a BIOS is a piece of software. Nowadays, it is a very complicated piece of software. It is much more complicated than what it needs to be. If you ask me, there are some BIOSes which have a very nice graphical user interface with a mouse and so on. They're very fancy. They're like little own OSs into their regards. And they have bugs. Of course they do. So whoever updates their BIOS, especially on Windows PC, it is very rare for anybody to take the effort and download a BIOS update. It's often with a very uncomfortable and, you know, not easy to follow procedure that, you know, it takes time and nobody does it. And just to give you a perspective, this is a timeline of all of the bugs that have been found, all of the security research that has been done since 2004 on all of the, on the BIOS. And all of these bugs that are presented here can be leveraged for doing specifically these attacks. Whether we're talking about compromising, so I can filter in this nice interface, whether it's USB, whether it's, let's say, the Thunderbolt interface, whether it's from the network card of a system, whether it's by hiding something in the system, management mode. I mean, all of this research, and you can see how in recent years we have a lot of research on this topic that is spiking up. And if we, instead, if we go before, especially before 2009, we can see that there was no activity on this area. So kind of after the evil Maid term was coined, and especially with the introduction of secure boot. I mean, secure boot is a security technology, so it's been looked very thoroughly in the last years. We can see that there are a lot of problems, exactly like software. But at the same time, I don't know many people that update their BIOS. So this is you can see the issue right there. There's also one other problem, and this highlights the difference between attacks that can also affect the state of the device. So if I have a piece of hardware which is running, and I have physical access to it, so I'm able to reboot that hardware, I can also do attacks such as the cold boot attacks. So what does the cold boot attacks does? If you have your laptop open and you have full disk encryption, so everything is encrypted, and you're using it, the contents, typically the key which is used for decrypting your hard drive relies somewhere in memory. And the issue is that when you reset the computer, the contents of your memory, even if you are resetting the memory, they stay there for a certain amount of seconds. Even if you completely turn off the laptop and you turn it on, let's say after 2 seconds, the contents will be there. So if I completely cut the power to a device, this works with pretty much any device, and then I put the power back on, if I am able to execute code at the very beginning, and let's say that this code doesn't concern about injecting malware so that maybe 2 hours after you're typing the password and we're going to intercept that. Let's forget about any of that. I can simply, if I can launch code at my desire, I can simply inspect the memory contents and I can retrieve all of the data that was stored there. So in this image we see, this is from this paper from 2008, we see an image which is being recovered after 5 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and 5 minutes from shutting the laptop or whatever target device completely off. And this is called the cold boot attacks. And you might think that this attack is very exotic, so we do a lot of auditing and penetration testing on embedded systems, An embedded system, as I mentioned before, typically they tend to be more secure if you're using all of their security features in protecting you from really the data which is on them. On embedded system, we use this almost daily. Every time we have to attack an embedded system device which is securely implemented, which is very rare, by the way, but anyway, when it happens, we can always perform some kind of secure boot attack to extract the key that was used to secure those contents at the very first boot. It works all the time. So if, as an evil Maid, I have the opportunity of launching code at the very beginning, even if you have the strongest encryption in the world, this is also a possibility. So it is very important not to allow code execution at any moment, at any step of the way. And these attacks can always be mounted by disassembling, removing the memory from your hardware and then analyzing it, of course. But that is something which it's fairly unrealistic on modern machines. It takes a lot of time, it is very risky, and of course it will leave a lot of traces of your evil Maid. So, of course, that can always be done, but at least, you know, if I can launch software, I can do that very, very easily, because I can just install code which dumps the memory, put it on a flash drive, and I go away. And nobody knows that I've ever been there, except for the fact that the machine rebooted. And the other problem is that even with all of this protection, with secure boot and so on, because out of the implicit trust that is done, it's appointed to devices which are plugged on your device. So we're talking really about design or specific vulnerabilities that are present into BIOSes, as we discuss. It is most of the cases possible to inject malicious code by plugging external devices. So this is an example called Thunderstrike, which was a problem found by Trammell Hudson, where you could attach a Thunderbolt device on an Apple machine. So this is a Thunderbolt network adapter. And this adapter, because of the way the Thunderbolt protocol works, is allowed to give code to the machine that has to be loaded at boot by design. And this code doesn't need to be signed, even if secure boot is enabled. So, and this happens because Thunderbolt is a very kind of complex protocol which at the most simple explanation bridges PCI Express, which is a protocol which is used for internal components of your laptop, to the outside. So it provides a very intimate connection to your hardware from the outside. So in this case, it was just a matter of plugging in a device, putting in the laptop, and boom, it is compromised. Now, I would say that since Apple recently acquired Legbacore, which is one of the companies which created most of the talks that were present on this diagram here, I think that with Apple devices, you stand a much better chance of protection against these specific attacks. But even when they disclose and these kind of bugs, it was not simply one bug. It was like 10. And maybe 5 were very easy to address, 3 a little more difficult, but the last one, some of them were still there. Because especially when they come to design flaws, they're very difficult to fix without breaking compatibility with other drivers or other peripherals and so on. So this is the risk, and especially if you don't update your BIOS. Most of people have BIOSes which are years old. So even if these bugs are discovered, you know, they'll never get patched because most vendors, they don't have a reliable way to push updates into this area. And so, as we can see, whether we're booting a machine or whether we're in runtime makes a difference. But as an attacker which has physical access to the device, most of the times I can decide to put the machine in a specific state. If it's on, I can decide to leave it on. I can shut it off. I can boot it. Or I can pretty much have control of that state. And this is very important when it comes to security. And also, the other big issue, which is also a lot part of our work when testing, it's that if your OS is fully booted, even if it's locked, even if you're locking it, it exposes pretty much all of the drivers that are supported for whatever device you're plugging into the laptop. So let's say if I plug a USB device, its enumeration, it's not prevented if the machine is being locked. The network doesn't go down if you lock a machine. If you're downloading something in your browser, it will continue to download that software. If a server is listening, it will continue to do so, unless you put it into sleep mode. But then you can always turn it on, and even if it's locked, all of these processes will still take place. And there are so many drivers that are supported on, let's say, Windows, that finding one of them which has a bug, it is, I would say, extremely, extremely simple. If your objective is to find any bug that would allow you to achieve your goals, you will find it. So the attack surface is enormous when it comes to USB. And with things like Thunderbolt, maybe it's not as big as USB, but it's very unexplored and very insecure. As of today, nobody has ever implemented a Thunderbolt fuzzer. And this is going to happen very soon. And what do you think is going to happen when that is done? I mean, it's gonna fall to pieces like a house of cards. So just to give you an example, and this, we come back to the hardware that we created. So this is fully open hardware, by the way. So this is a little Linux computer in a USB device. And why am I mentioning this? Because this allows to very easily emulate malicious USB devices. So this is called the USB Armory. It was designed for protecting your data, but as any security tools, it's a double-edged sword. It can be used for defense, but it also can be used to offense. And very recently, we found a bug with it. So if we talk about USB enumeration, USB is a very complex protocol. If you have a USB port, you can plug a hub, you can plug more devices. So there's a complex enumeration process which allows you to have more than one device. Also, one device can potentially expose more than one driver. You can have USB devices which are both a flash drive as well as a modem. For instance, it is very typical for the modems that you buy, the 3G modems, to also have a micro SD card in it, and you see them as two devices. So there's a very complex enumeration which happens in understanding how many USB devices am I seeing? Is there a hub? How are they working? What's their speed? What are the power requirements? And this happens before this specific driver for this specific device functionality is loaded. And once all of that is done, so when all of this enumeration process is done, then we go to the so-called function. And the function is understanding if the device I'm talking to is a drive, it's a keyboard, it's a mouse, or it's a modem, and so on. And for instance, in the case of the mass storage, then we load an additional driver, which on certain operating system is the same driver that we use for reading from normal hard drive, from old school hard drive. So we have an even larger attack surface there, because we can decide to find bugs at the USB enumeration layer, at the function layer, or at the specific driver, which is in this case reading and writing to files, or even the file system layer. You know, when you have a format, a flash drive, you can select if it's going to be VFAT, is it going to be HFS for Apples. I mean, that's also some piece of code which is going to load, you know, something and potentially has bugs. So the attack surface is very large. So we very recently found a bug, which, this is very interesting. This was found and investigated on OS X, but then it turned out that it also applies on iOS. This is important. Code that you have on your laptop for Apple devices also applies to the phone, because they're trying to reuse the same code. So having a phone which has pretty much the same attack surface when it comes to USB of a standard OS on your laptop because they want to do code reuse, it's something which also kind of emphasizes the point that I'm trying to make. And this specific bug concerned the emulation of a network device from USB, which is what this device does by default. You plug it in and you see it as a server. You can have a web server on it, you can connect with SSH, you just see it as a normal TCP/IP connection. And if we would present specific USB parameters which would be invalid, then by loading the network driver, we were able to override specific section of memory. And the interesting thing is that this worked regardless of the session being locked or not. And the payload for triggering the bug was coming from the device to the machine, to the host. So this was completely unattended. And there was a little bit of drama there because this was announced 24 hours after the FBI told the world that they unlocked the iPhone. So of course I got 20 journalists asking me if this was the bug that was being used, because it was a very good candidate. We don't know. I think it's unlikely because this was only disclosed to Apple for fixing the problem, but we know in security that many people can independently find certain bugs. But this is a classic case where an evil Maid attack could have been taken place, regardless of a laptop or a phone in this case, because it would apply on both devices, because I would just be able to plug in this device, have some predefined scripts running from this device, and trigger some serious problems in the kernel level. So it wasn't on a user application level, and this is why it was so severe. There's an additional problem then, that if you're able to place code close to the hardware, you can find persistence in places which are usually not checked by your usual malware scanning, antivirus, and so on. The BIOS itself, it's a piece of code which is persistent, not on your hard drive, but on a chip which is on your hardware board, which it's seldom looked at. We have a lot of other chips, such as embedded controller, on your system, where they have more or less freedom against your laptop. So, and this is important. Let's see. I assume you're familiar with Tails. Tails is a secure OS. I think it was Snowden's favorite OS. And the point of Tails is that you can execute on any computer. So you boot from a USB device. And even if that computer was compromised by software, or even if it had malware in its hard drive, you never load that. So it kind of provides you a safe environment. And the guide from Tails says that Tails runs independently from the operating system installed on the computer. So if the computer has only been compromised by software running from inside your regular OS, then it is safe to use Tails. And they do account for hardware issues, but they say Tails does not protect against compromised hardware. But the problem is that often you can compromise the hardware from within the software. If at some point I can have some kind of privileged access on your computer which is close to the hardware, I can hide my malicious code into hardware. So this sentence is kind of very, very misleading. It doesn't mean that if your payload only comes from software, that then hardware cannot be exploited. And this is a problem which goes beyond the evil Maid and physical attack. We can have a purely software-driven payload, which if escalates enough privilege, it can hide into hardware and then somehow become a physical attack. And there are so many chips on any computers, and this is also part of our job, that have a lot of freedom and very little security on your system. We have embedded controller for the keyboard, for the power management, for the battery management, for flashing the LEDs, and for talking to the BIOS itself and managing its storage and so on. This is one example of the Apple System Management Controller. So we did a talk about the Apple System Management Controller a few years ago. And this chip, it is, by modern standards, very, very, not very powerful. But if there is enough power to run arbitrary code on it, especially on the newer ones, which are just ARM-based processors. So they're kind of like little mobile phone CPUs, which are spread across all hardware to handle various things. Also the Wi-Fi chips, even on phones, they tend to have a separate CPU which does other things. And the problem is that you can gain persistence on this device, and usually the firmware that goes on these devices is completely unsigned. There's no security. They care about security on the BIOS, they care about security on the OS, but it turns out that you can flash this thing without any problems. It takes some reverse engineering, but this was done by us and by multiple people. And then depending on the specific hardware that you're talking about, you can have severe effects. You can either have a privileged path to your kernel and exploit other bugs into its driver implementation, or if you have, let's say, a keyboard controller, if you are a keyboard controller, of course you can inject all of the keystrokes. On the Apple, this chip holds the file vault key when you go into sleep mode, and you opt in for the option of not asking for the password again when you go from sleep to wake up state. You can have that option, and so the question is, where does the password go? It goes there in that chip. So if you can be there and you can somehow exfiltrate that, which can be very exotic but very efficient if you're let's say that you have control of a simple LED and you're watching from far away. You can have the password being exfiltrated by Morse code if you look at it. I mean, it sounds funny, and it sounded funny a few years ago, but nowadays, it's absolutely realistic if you're motivated enough, right? You don't need network and so on. So these kind of exotic attacks are part of the scenario. And the opportunity for persistence, it's not limited to the machine that is in front of me. Also external devices, they can typically be flash. USB devices, most flash drives, they have a little CPU in them which has to handle the driver and so on. It can be changed, it can be flashed with anything you want if you're good enough in reverse engineering. But also, there are also USB peripheral inside your machine. On my laptop, the webcam and the micro SD reader are USB devices, which are, to all accounts, they work like external devices. They just happen to be plugged inside in a way which is not easy for me to detach, but some of them, they exhibit the same properties of external devices. They can be flashed, they have their own chip, and you can achieve persistence in there. And if you are on the USB bus, you can do things like emulating a keyboard. If you can compromise the firmware of a webcam, I mean, you can do a lot of things such as not turning the LED on if the webcam is operational. This is something that works, and it was done, and we've done it. But also you can decide to emulate a keyboard. I mean, why not? You are on the USB bus, so you can emulate whatever you want, and you can emulate whatever driver you want if you know of a bug of it. Bluetooth keyboards, mice, even the battery usually has some kind of firmware that then you can load. So this is a battery controller, and there's a chip on it, which is fairly powerful. There's a firmware. You can change it, and then depending on the connection that this battery grants you to your laptop, typically it's so-called the I2C bus, most of the times you don't gain a lot, but if there's a bug in the driver implementation of I2C, then I think it is very unexpected for users that by plugging in a battery, you could leverage on a security problem. And these are the kind of properties that nowadays are being looked on both the offensive side and the defensive side, because if you find an exploitable bug in this area, it becomes a very, very appealing target. And in our experience, 100% of our targets, whether they were point of sales, routers, printers, they could be attacked. And let's think about the threat scenario here. Maybe to achieve my goals as an evil Maid, I don't need to attack your laptop. Maybe I just need to attack the DSL router that you have on your desk, which probably has much less security than your laptop. And maybe, who knows, it has a microphone in it, you know, some modern devices, you know, the Amazon Echo, which you can talk to it, and it goes on the internet, and it listens to what you're saying, you can make an order. You know, the talk that we had before explained very well these kind of properties. So when we're focusing on these kind of attacks, we should not limit ourselves on the final price here. The operational context, OPSEC, it's very important. And all of the devices that surround us, as the previous talk made, are very, very, very vulnerable to these kind of issues. So the question is, what can you do? I don't think I have a good answer for that, because it's a very complicated problem. But hopefully, by knowing what it can be done, maybe the operational assessment of the security threat it can be a little more educated now. So, you know, like when you ski and you do avalanche training, what's the best way to deal with an avalanche? It's just not to get into one. The same problem here. If you can avoid, if you consider yourself to be a high-value target, don't leave your assets unattended if you can, to avoid the problem altogether. And this includes all devices that can be potentially used for this kind of problem. And this also comes to physical security, right? I mean, we discussed about the fine points of hardware exploitation on laptops, but maybe the evil Maid can just hide a camera into your hotel room and then see the passphrase, right? So we are talking about very specific fine details, but again, it's all the threat model that becomes interesting. Sometimes for an agency, it might be just easy to bug your hardware by hiding some external piece of hardware or putting somewhere under the bed. So it is a very complex topic to address. And no matter what recommendation I can give you, if the attack is very motivated, then it becomes very difficult to protect against. So, but update and password protect your BIOS and use full disk encryption. Those are fairly simple steps that anybody can take that greatly increases the bar for these kind of attacks to happen in a small time. And it's always a good idea. But again, know your threat model and be aware that these kind of security problems can happen from the most unexpected sources, whether it's a battery, a USB device, your webcam, or a bug in your room. So, and this is called OPSEC. So if you Google for OPSEC, you will find plenty of resources which will make you much more paranoid than what maybe my little talk has inspired you to be. So I hope that this was useful to you. I thank you very much for attending. And if you have any questions, I think we're right on time, and we have exactly 5 minutes for questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, I have just one question. If we look at a specific example, for example, you're an investigative reporter who is investigating wrongdoings of a secret service. So an agency. Obviously, they are much more advanced than you are. It's probably safe to say that if you're investigating them, you are a very high-value target. Yes. And I would say that it's impossible for me to kind of protect myself against them, right? Because if they're really highly motivated, they will find something, as you said. So what should I do? Should I go back to paper? Should I use like a ham radio, just like William Binney now?
No, ham radio is horrible. Yeah. It's unencrypted.
Yeah, but they perhaps they don't. So what, should I go back to paper and meeting face to face and say, okay, we will not use any digital communication?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, digital media gives you a lot of advantage in protecting yourself if you know how to do it. I would say that being aware of what is possible, it's the first key in protecting yourself. Because, you know, we have products in security and they sell to you, oh, you can achieve 99% security. That's fine. If that 1% gets you and you don't know about it, it doesn't really matter. So being aware of what can be done gives you that situational awareness where you can try to protect yourself and make life much more difficult to a potential attacker. Using travel laptops, which have very little state on them, and offload your data on more portable devices which you can carry around and not leave unattended, it's always a good idea. There are a lot of software which you can also install on laptops which provide monitoring. You can have your webcam always on, you can put a recording, you can have a connection to your phone, you can know if somebody is entering a room, you can see what they're doing. So at least, if you're using full disk encryption, we assume that the key cannot be extracted unless you give your laptop on. Just knowing that someone has tampered with your laptop, it is good enough. Because then you don't care. You're not going to touch that machine ever again. And you have a backup. So again, being aware, so you're not going to mitigate the attack in the first place, but at least you can limit its impact and not having fully executed. Because most of these attacks, they gain persistence, but then the actual payload is executed afterwards because you cannot extract the key. So there is something that you can do. It's not a lost cause. But always keep in mind that from operational security, they can always bug you. There are other means. It really depends on the motivation of the attacker. And don't assume that every agency has very, very high skills. It really varies between countries and between departments. So, you know, you never know.
I wonder if exists already in the mainstream market it's a kind of tool that you can plug and this tool creates something. And I guess this kind of mainstream tool is the one we have to keep in mind as a possible threat, something developed by an agency on purpose, as you were saying, a small percentage of likeliness.
So a tool that you can plug to achieve what? To protection or to detect?
To attack.
To attack?
Yeah, to understand how much we are likely to be attacked with such tool.
Attacking on these kind of bugs is always extremely complicated and extremely specific to your target. It is very difficult to do something like Metasploit for hardware and for these kind of physical attacks. So I would say that nothing is out there, and even if there would be something out there, I would tell you that it's completely unreliable. I mean, I'm in the business of doing hardware security, and every single time we need to test something, it is something almost completely different. And maybe the techniques are the same, but the implementation of the techniques, it's always completely different. If you have a very mainstream device, like an iPhone or an Apple computer, then things get a little easier for an attacker in terms of weaponizing a known exploit. But at the same time, you're also very good with updates. So it's always a cat and mouse game. You need to catch up. But it's very difficult to assess. There's a tool called ChipSec, which is very technical and very complicated for people that are not into this business, which can help you assessing the security of your computer internals in terms of protection and measurement. You have TPM, which provides measurements of your boot process. They're very technical, very difficult to comprehend. It is almost impossible to recommend them for mainstream. There's tools which engineers and developers can use to build on and then create a safer system. But to test these kind of issues, it's very, very complicated. Any other question? Yeah.
Don't you think that everything depends on the scenario? Because
yes,
for sure, hardware can be hacked, but nowadays computers are safer than before because, well, if you remember, you had on laptops PCMCA, that was the PCI bus.
Yes.
You had the FireWire that had DMA.
Well, now you have Thunderbolt, which also has DMA.
Yeah, okay, but USB is 10,000 times safer than
I disagree,
fireware. Because
USB exposes you 10,000 different drivers. And we touched one by accident, and we found exploitable bug kernel-wise on OS X and iOS. Yeah,
but by design, it should be safer.
Well, yes, it is safer. Until it is safer, yes, it is safer. But you always have to understand what's the level of discussion. From design, I could argue that some drivers, you have implicit trust of the driver, like a keyboard. And so if your computer is not locked, the security of USB is much worse than other input-output devices because it's easier to attack. But yes, but I'm going to give you the worst-case scenario. Let's say that you leave your laptop in your room, and let's say that it's super secure. You've done everything by the book. It is signed. It is locked. You've done everything in your power. Let's say that I'm a fully motivated attacker. What am I going to do? I'm going to do a relay attack. I'm going to replace your laptop, which looks identical. Yeah. And then that's going to relay to me the keystrokes, and they're going to be your passphrase. I'm going to relay the images exactly how they are. So, you know, at the bottom line, it is an impossible problem to solve unless you keep all of your assets with you at all time. It is very difficult. So, but at least what we're trying to do, we're trying to make the low-hanging fruits or the automated and weaponized bugs, which can happen just by plugging this device in your laptop, impossible to exploit. And that's going to make life much more difficult to any attacker, which is not motivated enough. But yes, we're doing better to a certain extent.
So implicitly, a new protection method is having a unique sticker
yes.
on your laptop, and nobody can replace it.
Yes, in fact, having unique traits on your hardware, and again, as I said before, knowing that it has been tampered with somehow, it is a much more important knowledge than spending all your time and effort to protecting that asset. You know, it's not like when they burglar your house, if you know that they're coming or they're inside, okay, you don't care, they took everything out. Here's a little different because they want to achieve persistence. This is not as easy as just stealing your laptop. You know, otherwise we won't be having this talk. But yes, you're right. Okay, just one more? One? No? Okay, we're done.
About mitigations, what about using old hardware or using a totally free software-loaded PC? Is this a surface attack reduction possibility?
Free software does not give you any specific advantage or disadvantage into exploitation. I might argue that for an attacker side, the easiness of exploitation, because the source is available, it is compensated by the tendency to be a little more secure in certain areas. So at the same time, it doesn't matter. If you run only free software, it's not going to make a difference. Running old hardware, it's a very bad idea, because old hardware tend to have very easily exploitable paths. So if you have a machine that has no secure boot, anybody can just compromise it very easily with very little know-how. So I don't think that would be a good recommendation. It would actually go against. Of course, if your attacker is prepared to attack a brand new model MacBook Pro and he sees the very old PCs, maybe they're not prepared for that. But theoretically, it makes things worse. So I wouldn't recommend that. Unless you're running a Commodore 64, maybe. Something that it's so old that, you know, you're bridging the gap of knowledge there. Anybody, thank you very much.